Can you connect
But
that conversation on courage and where we are with you? You say a lot that you're a revolutionary Christian. What does that mean?
mhm. That means that I'm in the world, but not of the world. I recognize that the dominant ways of the world are domination, exploitation, and oppression. And inside of the souls of men and women, the dominant orientations tend to be those of cowardliness, those of conformity, those of complacency, and at worst, indifference or callousness toward the suffering of others. So the question becomes, how do you engage in change and transformation of world and of self? And the Christian story, of course, is a story around a particular Palestinian Jew who tried to convince persons that they ought to be committed to something that is profoundly absurd in the world of domination and hatred, which was love. That the self ought to be committed to something that is absurd when you look deep in the dark corners of your own soul and you see complacency, cowardliness, and conformity. And he says, be not conformed to the world. Be committed to justice. He comes right out of prophetic Judaism, which is English. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. He's not talking about philanthropy, not talking about charity. He's talking about justice, a structural and institutional arrangement of a society. And Amos was not just talking to Israel. He was talking to all nations. So it was an indictment of Israel as an indictment of every nation. And I also come from the chocolate side of town, my brother. So my revolutionary Christianity comes out of the struggles of a black peoples who have been hated chronically, viciously for 400 years, but keep dishing out love warriors like John Coltrane and Curtis Mayfield and Aretha Franklin and Martin Luther King Jr. So that I have to be true to what has been put into me and recognize no matter how dim my moment is, I am still one who must be true to a calling that says you bear witness to truth telling and justice seeking. Truth, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, justice, love, manifest in public.
You wrote
and therefore you
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, just say it. But the important thing is being faithful unto death. You see, if people recognize you ain't gonna be faithful unto death, they can buy you off. You'll sell your soul for a mess of pottage any second. You got to be faithful unto death, not just in life, but unto death.
Do we have to think about our mortality to help us do that? Do we have to think about how death is coming?
Oh, absolutely. But not only that, but you got to learn how to die daily, so that when your physical death comes, you can use your physical death as a way of promoting a love and justice. Absolutely. Very much so. And learning how to die daily is to kill that fear, to kill that cowardliness, to kill that hatred, to kill that conformity to structures of domination, and to kill the indifference inside of ourselves that allows structures of domination to go on. And that's the history of movements. We know Christians have no monopoly on this. My God, Christians have been some of the biggest gangsters in the history of the species. But it's true for every religion. Every religion, you know, that Buddhists and Hindus, with the way they treat our Dalit brothers and sisters, you see. Judaism that is not prophetic, Judaism that has not been true to Amos and Esther, can be accommodating to forms of domination and occupation as we have right now. You've got Islam. My God, Islam, when it's not tied to prophetic Islam, the kind of Islam you see in the Malcolm X, for example, can be just as accommodating to hatred and domination and so forth. But not just religion, secular traditions too, my brother.
Yeah, can you explain? Because a lot of people think that secular traditions will let us escape, that if we just let go of these beliefs that are quote unquote wrong, that is some innate move of liberation. But it seems to me they replicate the same patterns.
Well, I mean, we know that, we can go back to pagan ones of just Stoics and the Epicureans and others, and there's some wonderful things about those traditions, and there's some ugly things about them. Stoics actually gave us conceptions of the universality of humanity that's very rich, that echoes that of prophetic Judaism and prophetic Christianity, prophetic Islam. But the secular moves usually are so tied to science Science itself can become an idol. See, there's a difference between scientific temper and scientific dogma. Scientific temper is so crucial, and we need that. The unleashing of human curiosity, the concern of evidence, the concern of conclusions being based on evidence and so forth. But we know in the name of science, they argued that women were less intelligent than men. In the name of science, white supremacy flowered and flourished. In the name of science, imperialism was promoted. In the name of science, capitalism was affirmed. So science itself is not monolithic. You have to have scientific tempers that are critical of the dogmas in science. And so when we talk about secularism is not a monolithic thing. There's some wonderful things about it in terms of being open-minded and self-critical and recognizing that we're finite and recognizing that we ought to listen to other people who we disagree with. And there's some arrogance and condescension in the secular culture vis-a-vis non-secular folk that reinforce the worst of human beings. Look at liberalism, which is a magnificent move of both secular and religious folk. But liberalism at its worst was what? Deeply imperialistic. Secular liberals still around in a very deep way. Secular neoliberals very much hegemonic among the professional classes, in the universities. What kind of dogmas are at work in the university? Do we have any critiques of empire coming out of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Chicago, Berkeley, Morehouse, Howard University? Can students really go to those institutions and understand the ways in which America was an empire from the very beginning? No, I mean, you got some wonderful voices. I was just looking at Brother Himmelwerp's work on How to Hide an Empire. It's a wonderful book. But he cuts against the grain. There's few, but not too many. Not too many at all. Because those institutions of higher learning and empires don't want to tell the truth about the empire that they inhabit. And that's just one example. You know, we've got ecological crisis, catastrophe coming. We got nuclear catastrophe coming. The wealth inequality, economic catastrophe, unbelievable loneliness, isolation, alienation of persons who have tremendous time even mastering any forms of intimacy, which is a precondition of love. Vulnerability, which is a precondition of love. So what happens in a more and more loveless society? What happens in a society that's obsessed with pleasure but has tremendous difficulty gaining access to joy? I mean, these are deep spiritual issues that go hand in hand with the decadence of a late capitalist civilization. And our poets have been talking about this for a long, long time, my brother. The musicians have been talking about this for a long, long time. That's why the artists, and especially musicians, are the vanguard of the species. That's why we live in a moment where we must look very much to our courageous, visionary artists. Now, we've got a whole wave of artists who are just mediocre, who are bad artists, who just sell their souls too. But I'm talking about the deep, genuine artists. And that's been the history of black people. You see, black people, we could never have made it without our artists, and especially our musicians. They have preserved black dignity and sanity.
Who are you
without
listening
black musicians,
to?
Black people would have been gone a long time ago. I'm listening to Dorothy Love Coates in the gospel tradition, and Curtis Mayfield, who comes out of gospel, but very much is a rhythm and blues brother. I listen to, there's a brother that got a serious single. His name is Jay. What's it? You know who I'm talking about?
James.
Jay Carmonica. Jay Hart. God, I can't remember his
Jay
name.
Electronica? No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Ooh.
Listen to him. All right.
Oh, yeah. But he got something going on. And he has Jay-Z. Jay-Z's a genius, but I'm critical of a lot of Jay-Z politics. But Jay-Z's art informs me in a very profound and wonderful way. But when it comes to hip-hop,
what about Chronics? You listen to any Chronics?
Siri X and Tef Poe. No, I haven't got too much to Chronic. I got to catch up though.
Reggae. I'm a reggae
Oh, it's a
fanatic.
reggae. He's reggae.
Yeah,
Oh,
I love all that.
no, I got,
Everybody
okay.
knows.
No, I love it. I love it. Coming out of the legacy of Bob Marley and Marcus Garvey and company.
Yes, and through
Land of
Garnet
Shadow.
Silk.
Yes. Ooh, Lord. See, you teaching me, man.
I love that stuff. Well, that's an obsession of mine.
But let me ask you this, though, that what
me.
I'm saying, does it make sense to you? Because I do respect your mind and your judgment. Does it make sense to you what I'm trying to say tonight?
It makes a lot of sense to me. And what I don't, and I mean, you've influenced me. and I've also remember you when you've talked about the cult of smartness and let's try to be wise and let our phones be smart. What I wonder about and what I am really curious about, and I talk with a really, really good friend of mine who people know from the show, Joshua Kahn, Russell, I'll bring him into the conversation, is what is the bridge in terms of like, I'm reading Peter Sloterdijk's book called You Must Change Your Life right now. And his politics are very different than our politics. But I love this idea that he's reworking religion as just an idea of practices, that it's about your own Olympian journey. And what I'm wondering is because it seems to me that the left is, and this is one of the reasons I will say I love and admire Lula so much, is that there's so much heart there. And so I'm trying to connect.
Rich heart. That's true.
How do we a politics that comes from so much empathy, but also doesn't necessarily generate the power in the Machiavellian sense to take on power, or have the kind of like spiritual nourishment for less of a, sometimes when I talk about this stuff, people look at me with a side eye, no, there is a spiritual dimension to this. What does that mean? Do people have to meditate? Do people have to listen to great music? I don't know. What is the bridge to engage it? Because I know that there's a whole emotional landscape that you speak to where if we don't access that, we cannot get to our destination. And I want to know what that bridge is. So it does make sense to me, but I want to know how it's actually created in people's actions and practices every day.
Well, I mean, it's got to go back to, the formation of the children in terms of the socialization of young people through civic institutions, from family, mosques, synagogues, churches, schools, temples, sports connections, music connections, all of those things. When they get weak, then there's no doubt it's going to be difficult. You can call it soulcraft. The institutional mechanisms of soulcraft. How are the souls of people shaped? How are their personalities shaped? How are their characters shaped? What kind of values and virtues and visions do they have access to? Now, again, the history of black folk is something that I think is quite instructive. Anytime the whole nation has the blues, that means that nation can learn a whole lot from the blues people in its midst. And the history of black people is one in which it looked as if we have no way out. I mean, that's what Henry Highland Garnett said in 1836. Black folk, never confuse your situation with that of the Israelites of the Hebrew scripture. For us, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Sea. What you gonna do when you live in a life in which Pharaoh's on both sides of the bloody Red Sea? But that's probably what Afro-pessimism is about. That's what our dear brother Frank Wilderson and others are talking about, right? Black folks' lives just cows waiting to be slaughtered. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, but that's not the last word. And I think Brother Frank would agree with that, even though Paul Taylor's review of his recent book in the Washington Post is a fascinating start for a conversation. But what have black people done? Well, we had to create on the margins structures of feeling, structures of value that were in America but not of America. And politically, when it came to the contestation for power, the best of the black tradition has recognized that both parties has never spoken in any serious way to our plight and to our predicament. So that either we had to hit the streets, we had to go to jail, that most of our leaders who told the truth knew they were going to be assassinated, literally, or their character assassinated. They knew that those leaders would be crucified, lied on, misunderstood, but people still were not fearful They were not fearful. Brother Martin used to say, I'd rather be dead than afraid. Marcus Garvey always had a folk at the very beginning of every rally. The Negro is not afraid, has no fear. And all of us have fear, but courage is a working through fear. So do you have to have courageous folk who are willing to cut against that grain. And the music and the literature and the painting provide some alternative vision of the reality you're in. The great August Wilson, you know, the great playwright with his 10 cycle plays of fences and so forth. He used to say every time a artist, especially a black artist, produces, they're authorizing an alternative reality. And you can't sustain a left movement without authorizing an alternative reality that is not just contra what's in place, but actually is a positive, constructive vision analysis, and most importantly, courage of willing to live and die. That's what I love about Adolph Reed. That brother is going to die anti-capitalist. It's just a fact.
It's just a fact.
He's consistent. He's got
very,
what James Austin called constancy. Now, I don't agree with everything Adolph puts forth. Not at all. I've taught him in my class for years. He and I fight like dogs 30 years ago. But he's always been my brother. And he is a intellectual who's committed to getting us to see with different analysis, getting us to discern with different lens through which to view the world. And that's what serious folk do. And of course, that's precisely what great poets do. Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That's the last line in Defense of Poetry, that posthumous text that he published after he died in his young life. He's absolutely right. He said, how do we see differently? And it's hard to see differently if you're just locked into corporate media. That's why we love Sister Amy Goodman show. That's why we love Michael Brooks show. You know what I mean? That's why we love the Michael Moore show. That we have some alternative lens to look at the world. And no, none of us have a monopoly on truth. We all in this jazz orchestra together. We're raising our voices, trying to empower others, all with a partial view, none of us having the full truth. But together we come closer to reality with more love, commitment to justice, more courage, and then go down swinging before the worms get our bodies.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it almost seems to me like if you take time to read something that doesn't necessarily, you can't quantify reading a novel.
That's right.
You can't place a value on it. But when you step and you reclaim time to do that, you're actually in a very small way prototyping or enacting a very different reality.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's why the Socratic legacy of Athens is so important. And Socrates says, look, I'm going to examine myself and society critically, and I'm going to be faithful unto death. And that example itself will serve as a catalyst for other people to see themselves differently. It will provide a process to see themselves differently through self-criticism. And I would say the same thing about the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. That's precisely what Esther and Amos and Jesus and Muhammad are about. I want you to see the world differently. I want you to be able to keep track of the suffering, keep track of the misery, and to respond to it in such a way that is tikkun olam. You can change it. You can amend it. But then you have to have the scientific legacy of the Enlightenment, which is to say you're going to need some analytical tools. You have to understand what capitalism is all about. You're going to understand what these forms of imperialism are all about. You have to try to understand gender, not in terms of some abstract category, but ways in which male supremacy have been shot through pre-capitalist and capitalist and white supremacist practices. And the same is true in terms of transphobia, homophobia, and what have you. But in the end, it's going to be a way of life. And this is something that is very difficult, I think, in our civilization. Most people have a lifestyle rather than a deep, serious way of life. So the lifestyle comes from the market, the titillization, the carrots, the status, the money that's dangled in front of us, and we're obsessed with success, and we lose out on moral and spiritual greatness. But moral and spiritual greatness comes from a way of life. And that has to do with a calling. It has to do with vocation. And that's why you can just read anybody. I mean, good God Almighty, it could be the highest level of a Shakespeare or a Beethoven or a Mary Lou Williams or a John Coltrane, or it could be medium. You know, you could be listening to some of the popular groups around who are wonderful, but they ain't Beethoven. You know, they're wonderful, but they're not Mary Lou or Coltrane. That's all right. Everybody don't have to be at that high level. But they're coming from their souls. If they're coming from their souls, if they're just playing for money, then it's a different kind of thing.
And you can feel it. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.